I now have the pleasure of introducing our first presenters, Ben and Josiah. Ben Wilkowski grew up outside Columbus, Ohio, received a Ph.D. in social psychology from North Dakota State University, and is now a professor of psychology at UW. His interest in democracy flows out of a professional interest in how people's emotions and values help to coordinate people's behavior and bind them into groups, and out of a personal passion for upholding democratic ideals. Josiah Peck has lived in Wyoming for the past 10 years and has worked as a mental health and school counselor for much of that time. He is currently a grad student at UW, pursuing a Ph.D. in social psychology. Josiah is interested in finding ways to bring people together to communicate about and participate in democratic and civil life.
So, yes. Thank you, Robbie. So yes, in recent years, democracy has stumbled, unfortunately. As this figure here shows, let me see if I can get this off. Shows in red right here, the number of countries undergoing a democratic crisis or an autocratization episode has risen since approximately the turn of the century. And in our project here, one of our major focuses was to zero in on one of those democratic crises, specifically in Brazil. So, as many of you might already know, during his presidential term, Jair Bolsonaro made many attempts to undermine Brazilian democracy, such as threatening freedom of speech, freedom of the press, indigenous rights, undermining the election system itself, or at least attempting to. Ultimately, though, Bolsonaro failed, and Brazilian democracy emerged resilient from this period of its history. So because of that, we thought Brazil would make a useful case study to help us understand when one wishes to help uphold democracy, how can they effectively do this? So yes, a useful, instructive example there.
Okay, cool. So one of our hypotheses that we were looking at is that language that supports democracy would be present in these autocratic crises that are going on, and that language that's tied to democracy might be connected to getting out of that crisis. And so when we talk about the values of democracy, what we're really talking about is this model from Wessel, and this is his book, Freedom Rising, where they talk about emancipative values. And what emancipative values are, this is how they're measured, and they're measured routinely across Europe in these giant surveys on a countrywide basis. And the questions they ask to make up these values are questions about autonomy, especially autonomy with children, so allowing children to do the things that they want to do, having the ability to make their own choices. Questions about equality, especially equality considering equal opportunity between genders to get jobs, and in leaders, and in education. To talk about questions about choice, so especially questions about who gets to choose to get divorced, who gets to choose to get married, who gets to choose to have an abortion, and then finally questions about freedom of speech, and how much freedom people feel like they have in the local and national kind of level of their country. And yeah, so we believe that, or at least our hypothesis was that we would find this language within these cultures if they were to survive democracy.
So yes, the major reason that we hypothesize this is because emancipative values are the values that have advanced democracy really throughout history. This was one of the major focuses of Wetzel's book here. This graph is just one illustration of this. It shows you that countries where the average person valued emancipation more, those countries, the quality of their democratic institutions improved in the years following the survey. So this particular survey was right before the fall of the communist Soviet bloc, and you see advances in democracy in those countries especially. So yes, that's the reason for our hypothesis. So yes, our project itself, the first thing we wanted to do is identify what is the language that helps uphold democracy. So to do that, our first set of analysis focused on the UN general debates, where at the beginning of their sessions, each member country is invited to give an address to the rest of the UN, outlining their priorities and trying to persuade other member nations to support those same priorities. So a rich source of language, basically. And what we did is we used a program called Luke, or the Linguistic Inquiry Word Count software program, to extract a number of linguistic indices from these speeches. And you see examples over there on the screen. And what we found is that the representatives of countries high in emancipative values and also highly democratic countries showed a particular linguistic pattern in their speeches, which you see outlined here. So briefly, some of the indicators of what we started to call emancipative language were more frequent usage of words like we, which is a sign of referencing a shared identity with others or a shared relationship with others. Overall, in these speeches, there's a rather extreme bias for more references to men than women. But these representatives of these countries showed less of that bias, both because of more references to women and fewer references to men. And finally, representatives of these countries de-emphasized power, anger, and also, interestingly, religion in their speeches. In the context of the UN especially, whether you're referencing Jesus, Allah, Buddha, or any other religion, what you're doing is you're highlighting something that's very, very different between different member countries. So you're highlighting that which divides, basically. So broadly, emancipative language seeks to de-emphasize power and factors that divide people, and instead emphasize factors that unite people, and make sure that they're all included in the political conversation, that they're all considered.
Okay, so once we have identified what kind of language politicians are using that's connected to these more democratic values, we turn back to Brazil's National Congress over this period of a democratic crisis. And Brazil, of course, made it through this democratic crisis without turning into an autocracy. And what we did is we looked at the same linguistic indexes over time during that process. And what we found was that both over time, a very similar pattern of results, and also connected to as democracy was changing. So the ratings of democracy in the data set that we're using. And so what we see is that, yes, even in Brazil, over time, as they made it over through this democratic crises, we pronouns were predicting the change in democracy the year after. We see similar things with our female and male references becoming more balanced, and a decrease in talking about power motives. And so this kind of power language. One difference that we saw in the Brazilian data set is not a lot of change in religion. Negative 0.01 is very small. It's still significant, but we attribute that at least partially to Brazil on the national stage being a pretty much Catholic country. And so religion being less divisive perhaps there than it would be on an international stage. And we also see this difference in angry emotions, which actually rose during this crisis. And we thought that was particularly interesting. And within that context, it would make sense that people who are trying to support democracy are kind of upset that democracy isn't being, or feeling like democracy is in crises. And so we saw positive connection there.
All right. So yes, that was our project itself. But more importantly, what does this mean? When one wants to help uphold democracy, what should one actually do? These analyses have several implications. The most straightforward implication is that if you want to uphold democracy, use language that authentically expresses and supports these emancipative values. You saw some examples of that. How this is typically done in speeches, it often comes across with more we languages, more balanced references to the different genders and so on and so forth. So that's one way it often comes across, but we do want to emphasize that you have to do this in a way that authentically supports those values. If white men, for example, are using the word we only to refer to other white men, that would not have the intended effect. So it's what those words express that you want to focus on here. Second implication here is don't try to fight fire with fire. The language of autocracy is easily recognizable. It's angry. It relies on power assertion. And when you see or hear this kind of language, it's often tempting to want to respond in kind. And what our analyses suggest is, well, part of that is fine, basically. Emancipative appeals, we found, are sometimes quite angry. You saw this in the Brazilian data set, especially, where, yeah, when democracy is under threat, it's natural for people who value that to get angry, and even arguably useful to express that anger. So anger can be part of the language that upholds democracy under some circumstances. But the other part there is we should not use power-based language. Power-based language robs other people of their autonomy. It works against these emancipative values. So you're basically undermining the values that support democracy if you appeal to power. So instead, we need to respect other people's autonomy and freedom of choice.
Yeah, and so just to finish this up, we feel that this makes sense with democracy because democracy is connected to lots of positive outcomes. Democracy is connected nationally or internationally with levels of happiness, with levels of peace, with levels of education, with levels of economic development. Democracy is a good thing for most people, for almost everybody that's within a democracy. And so one of these implications when we're dealing with people that might be threatening our democracy or feeling that they're threatening our democracy is to show that democracy is good for them as well. Autocracies don't normally work out well for the average citizen, but democracies do. So things like freedom of religion. And just to illustrate or emphasize that this is a freedom to choose for people, but not a freedom to dominate others or make their choices for them. We like this phrase, be intolerant of intolerance, which I think came from Wetzel, right? Finally, this is a data set made out of politicians and political speeches. And so I think there's an implication for supporting politicians that use these kinds of emancipated values if you want to support democracy. So be paying attention to the types of language that politicians are using. And I think that's about it.